Last night at dinner, my own son raised his glass and laughed, calling me a failure in front of everyone. They thought I was just an old man clinging to the past. I stayed quiet, swallowing the humiliation, but deep inside, I remembered the truth. This very house, the cars in his garage, even the company he brags about, they all carry my name. I didn't speak then, because when the time comes, the silence of a father can turn into the loudest thunder. Do you want to know what happened when I finally revealed the secret I had kept all along? Stay with me until the end of my story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment the city you're watching from. The cold air of a Houston winter evening clung to my coat as I stepped out of the cab and stared up at the house my son called his own. Bright lights framed the wide windows, and laughter spilled out as if the place itself was alive. I remembered when this lot was nothing but dirt and weeds. Back then, every brick and beam that rose here had been funded with money I earned, sweat I poured, and sacrifices I made. Now it stood towering, sharp and modern, a palace that felt less like a home and more like a stage. I walked up the steps, cane tapping against the stone, and knocked. The door swung open to reveal my daughter-in-law's tight smile. She greeted me like an obligation, a quick hug that ended before I could return it. Inside, the warmth of the house contrasted the chill outside, yet something colder lingered in the air, an undercurrent I had grown accustomed to. The conversations dimmed for a moment as I entered, then rose again, as if my presence mattered less than the clinking of glasses. The dining table stretched across the room, covered in dishes so rich and plentiful it looked like a holiday feast. Everyone had a place, their plates filled high with roasted meats, glazed vegetables, and steaming rolls. My seat, tucked at the end, bore only a plate with a dry piece of bread. No one noticed. Or perhaps they did, and chose silence. I broke the crust slowly, the rough edges scraping the roof of my mouth. The chatter swirled above me, as though I were invisible. Then came the laughter. My son raised his glass, eyes gleaming, and in a voice meant to carry across the room, he said, "You know, growing up, I always worried I'd end up a failure like my old man." The words hung heavy, followed by uneasy chuckles from the guests. Their smiles faltered when they glanced at me, but none dared to object. My son grinned wider, proud of his punchline. A warmth spread across my chest, not from wine, but from shame that burned hotter than fire. I sat motionless, fingers gripping the edge of the table. Memories stormed through me: long nights on construction sites, overtime hours, skipped meals, all so he could stand where he was now. The very company he boasted about had once been my dream, handed down to him piece by piece. Respect, it seemed, had dissolved into mockery. Silence pressed against my ears while they laughed. I stared at the bread in front of me, the dry crumbs on my fingers. Once I was the provider. Now I was the joke. My son carried on, raising his glass higher. To hard work and success, he toasted. To making it on our own, the guests followed suit, crystal chiming like bells of betrayal. No one looked at me. No one cared to notice the storm tightening in my chest. I clenched my fist under the table. The skin stretched white across my knuckles. The bitterness of the bread lingered, but a different taste filled my mouth. Resolve. Let them laugh tonight. Let him believe his words had cut me down. Inside, a vow formed, quiet and steady. This humiliation was no accident. It was the beginning of something carefully planned. And if he thought I would sit by silently, he had forgotten who built the very foundation under his feet. That night, the morning sunlight crept through the tall windows of my son's house, casting sharp beams across the polished floor. Sleep had been shallow, broken by the echo of laughter from the night before, the laughter that followed when I was called a failure. A dull ache sat in my chest, heavier than the winter air pressing against Houston that morning. The silence of the house didn't comfort me. It reminded me that I no longer belonged here. I could hear faint sounds from the kitchen, the kind of busy clatter that excluded me instead of welcoming me. At breakfast, the entire family gathered around the table. Chairs scraped against the floor as they settled in, each one tall and sturdy. Then came mine, a seat lower than the rest, the cushion thin, legs unsteady. It wobbled beneath me as I sat, making me appear smaller, hunched, as though my presence needed to be diminished. My son and his wife exchanged a glance, then smiled casually, pretending it was nothing more than an old chair. Their voices carried warmth for everyone else, but when they spoke to me, it was with a politeness reserved for strangers. I steadied myself on the table edge, cheeks burning, knowing this wasn't an accident. The chair brought back another memory years earlier, in the company boardroom. That day, I was placed in the corner, on a fragile seat that creaked with every shift of my weight. The others sat in plush, commanding chairs while I felt reduced to a visitor in the business I had built. Twist S18 replayed vividly. And now, facing this wobbly chair at my son's table, I knew the parallels weren't coincidence. The erasure I felt in the company was bleeding into my home life. It was a message. Subtle but sharp, I was no longer part of the structure, only an obstacle to be managed. As the family passed dishes, I kept my hands still. They talked over me, voices bright with plans and laughter that didn't include my name. I thought back to decades of labor, of long nights when I built both the roof over their heads and the company that supported it. Each sacrifice had been made for them. Yet here I was, swaying on a chair meant to remind me of my fading place. My son spoke easily, his tone light, but his words carried the weight of calculation. It wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. By the end of breakfast, the mask slipped. My son leaned back, fork clinking against his plate, and said with a laugh, "Running things is easier without dead weight." The words pierced sharper than the chair's wobble. I clenched my jaw, steadying myself, refusing to let the humiliation spill onto my face. A decision formed quietly inside me not to fight just yet, but to watch, to observe. Because every detail was beginning to add up, and I needed to see the whole pattern before I acted. That morning, I understood something grim. I wasn't a father at this table anymore. I was a guest waiting to be erased. The house felt strangely hollow that week, as if the walls themselves had learned to keep secrets. Moving slowly through the kitchen one morning, I noticed a stack of Christmas cards neatly arranged on the counter. Each one bore names and cheerful greetings: my son, his wife, even the grandchildren. Yet as I searched through them, there was nothing with my name, not a single envelope addressed to me. It shouldn't have mattered, I told myself. They were just cards, but standing there, staring at the row of carefully displayed tokens of family connection. The absence pressed into me like a cold wind. It wasn't an oversight. It was a message. That sight triggered a memory I had tried to bury. Months earlier, the company banquet hall had glowed with chandeliers, the tables dressed in white linen. I sat near the back, watching as my son took the stage, his name booming from the speakers. He accepted an award for visionary leadership, smiling confidently while cameras flashed. Applause filled the room, but not for me. Every achievement he boasted about had been laid brick by brick on the foundation I built. Yet not once did he mention my name. I sat there, stiff in my chair, clapping weakly with the others, while my life's work was paraded as if it were his alone. The humiliation tasted familiar now. Then it was the applause. Here it was, the missing card. Two events, worlds apart, braided into the same truth: I was being erased. At the office, my contributions had been quietly buried beneath his speeches. At home, even something as small as a Christmas card reminded me of how expendable they believed I was. Erasure wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. I thought of my late wife, her faith in him so complete. She had always said, "He'll carry what you built with honor. He'll protect the family." She believed it with every part of her heart. Standing alone in the kitchen, staring at those cards, the weight of her misplaced trust burned like a wound. What would she say if she saw this? Would she see through him, or cling to the hope that blinded her that night? I quietly placed an old photograph on the counter, where the missing card should have been. It was a picture of her and me, taken decades ago, smiling in front of the house I built with my own hands. For a moment, it felt like reclaiming space they had tried to deny me. As I turned to leave, voices drifted from the hallway. My son's tone was low but sharp. "It's time to think about removing dead weight for good," he whispered. My daughter-in-law murmured agreement. The words struck harder than any insult at a dinner table. It wasn't just thoughtless cruelty anymore, it was a plan. My chest tightened, fists curling at my sides as I stood frozen in the shadows. At that moment, I realized the insult wasn't random. It was a campaign to erase me completely. The dinner invitation came with a strange chill. Even before I stepped into the house, Marla's voice over the phone had sounded too sweet, her words dripping with a politeness that didn't quite fit. Walking through the doorway that evening, I felt less like family being welcomed home and more like a guest summoned for a staged performance. The warmth of family dinners I once knew had long vanished, replaced by a kind of cold hospitality that made every smile feel rehearsed. The table was set with precision, dishes aligned as if the meal was meant for display rather than comfort. My son sat at the head, his posture stiff, his eyes carrying that glint I had come to recognize an eagerness to remind me of my place. I sat down with the quiet weight of unease pressing on my chest. Every movement around me, every half-smile and whisper between them, deepened that gnawing sense that this was no ordinary meal. As the dishes were passed, laughter filled the room. Though not directed at me, Marla reached into her handbag, her hand moving with a kind of rehearsed confidence. She pulled out a slim envelope and placed it in front of me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is to help you manage," she said, her tone dripping with a false kindness. I stared at the envelope. It was light, almost insulting in weight. Inside was $500, neatly folded as though I were some dependent, a child being handed pocket money. Around the table, the chatter died down. My son leaned back in his chair, watching for my reaction, his smirk barely concealed. The humiliation hit hard, not because of the money itself, but because of what it symbolized being stripped of dignity in front of those I had given everything to. My jaw tightened. Memories of years spent building the very foundation of their lives' sacrifices. Sleepless nights. The business I had nurtured flashed before me. And now, reduced to this envelope, I didn't speak. Instead, I slid the envelope back across the table, my fingers trembling not from age but from the fury I worked so hard to suppress. The silence grew heavy, until my son chuckled, brushing it off as if it were all just a light-hearted gesture. Yet, the sting lingered. After dinner, as I walked through the hallway, my eyes caught a new frame on the wall, a large family portrait, perfectly centered. I stepped closer, studying each face. There they all were, my son, his wife, the children, even distant relatives. But not me. The place I once occupied in such portraits had been erased, replaced by someone else. My chest tightened. It wasn't just omission. It was replacement, a deliberate act, as if to announce that my presence, my legacy, had no place in their vision of family. That picture told a story they wanted others to believe that I was never part of it. I stood there, staring, until my son's voice broke the silence. "Do you like it?" he asked casually, almost daring me to react. My hand brushed against the frame. But I didn't let it shake. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "Be careful," I said, my voice low, steady, each word carrying the weight of years. "Be careful not to erase the very man who built all this." The room went still. Marla's smile faltered. My son, however, smirked, tilting his head as though amused. "Maybe it's time you accept your place," he said coldly. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and gripped the banister of the staircase, my knuckles whitening around the wood. The weight of betrayal pressed hard, but beneath it burned something stronger, a resolve taking shape. That was the night the war began. No longer would silence serve as a shield. From that moment, silence would become my weapon, sharper than any words they could throw at me. The weekend dinner had a strange heaviness to it, like a storm waiting to break. I sat at the end of the long table, trying to keep my hands steady on the silverware. Every clink of glass or scrape of a chair echoed sharper than it should. Damien and Marla laughed too loudly with the guests they'd invited, making sure every glance and word reminded me I was only tolerated here. When Eli, my grandson, tugged gently at my sleeve, the room seemed to hush in a way no one noticed but me. His little hand held out a small cupcake, the kind children save like treasures. "Grandpa, I saved this for you," he whispered, eyes bright with pride. Warmth surged through me. For a brief moment, love outweighed every insult, every bruise of the past weeks. But then Marla's shadow loomed. She plucked the cupcake from Eli's hand before it reached mine. "Oh no," she said, smiling wide enough for everyone to hear. "Grandpa doesn't need sugar at his age." And with a flick of her wrist, she tossed it into the trash. The thud of that tiny cake hitting the bin sounded louder than any insult so far. Eli's face fell, his joy crumpling into confusion. My chest tightened. That cupcake was more than sugar, it was love, trust, and innocence, discarded in front of everyone. The cruelty was sharp and deliberate. I kept my eyes on Eli, offering the gentlest nod I could manage, while inside a storm of anger and helplessness clawed at me, as if nothing had happened. Damien stood, glass raised high, to the future of our family business. He declared, glasses lifted all around me, sparkling in the light. But not a single eye turned my way. No one thought to include me. Their cheer was a celebration of progress that erased its own foundation. I didn't lift my glass. My hand stayed still, knuckles white. Bitterness settled like ash on my tongue. The laughter that followed was a wall shutting me out. Once again, I was reminded they weren't merely neglecting me, they were chiseling me out of the family stone, piece by piece. Later, when the table quieted, I drifted into myself. I thought about how simple a child's love was pure, unquestioning, and how quickly adults poisoned it with pride, with the need to control. Silence had been my shield for weeks, but I knew now that they mistook it for weakness. They believed every laugh, every dismissal, chipped away at me. They couldn't see silence sharpening itself into something else. The night ended with another toast, another laugh, another round of exclusion, yet through it all, Eli's eyes kept finding mine. Those small, searching eyes carried the question he couldn't say aloud. "Why won't they let me love you?" I leaned closer just enough for him to see my lips move. No one else noticed. "I won't let them erase me," I mouthed. His face softened, though he still looked uncertain. Inside me, the decision hardened. That night, I swore their cruelty would no longer go unanswered. Love thrown away was one thing, but dignity, legacy, and identity would not follow it into the trash. The envelope came early in the morning, the kind of hour when silence still sits heavy in the house. A courier knocked, left it on the porch, and drove off before I could even open the door. It was thick, stamped with official markings, A feeling settled in my chest before I even slid it open, one I'd grown to know all too well lately. Inside were pages of legal language, heavy with accusations dressed as concern. The words petition for guardianship leapt out like a slap. They claimed I was mentally incompetent, unable to manage my affairs. My own children had taken steps to strip me of my rights, of my dignity, and of the very control I had spent a lifetime building. For a long moment, the room blurred, the morning light through the blinds, the sound of the fridge humming. Even the photo of my late wife smiling from the mantel, all of it faded behind the weight of those papers. Someone had signed their names to this, and I didn't need to guess twice. The arguments came back to me the way Damien had raised his voice, the way Ellen had spoken softly, almost pitying, asking if I'd remembered to take my pills. Marla dropping hints that maybe I was too tired to keep up with the family business. Every gesture, every word had been laying bricks for this wall. It wasn't clumsy concern. It was a plan. I sat at the table, staring at the petition, until the knock came again. This time it was deliberate, sharp, confident. When I opened the door, Linda Green stood there, folder in hand, her face serious. "May I come in?" she asked. Linda had been a trusted lawyer, someone I'd leaned on for years. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Sitting across from me, she laid out her copy of the documents. "These aren't drafts," she said. "They've already been filed in court. Petitioners are Ellen and Damien. A hearing is scheduled." The words dug deep. Ellen, my little girl who once ran through this very living room barefoot, clutching a teddy bear. Damien, my son, who inherited not only my name but the very foundation of everything he had. And now, they stood united, not as children, but as predators circling a weakened man. Linda's voice carried a mix of professionalism and quiet pity. "They'll argue you're unfit to handle finances or decisions. If the court agrees, you lose control of your estate, your company shares, even decisions about where you live." I looked around the house. Every corner held a memory, the chair where my wife used to knit, the clock I fixed with my own hands, the oak table I bought after my first big contract. This wasn't just a house. It was the story of my life. And now, my own blood wanted to erase me from it. I folded the petition slowly, tucking it back into its envelope. The shame was sharp, but sharper still was the burn of anger rising beneath it. My children thought they had cornered me. They thought the man who had built their comfort, their security, would go quietly into a trap they laid. They were wrong. Linda met my eyes, her tone softening. "You need to prepare. This won't be easy." I nodded, but inside a different thought took root. They were preparing for a courtroom battle. I was preparing for something else entirely. Because if they believed I would surrender everything, my name, my work, my dignity, then they had forgotten who raised them and who built every brick of the empire they now called theirs. The morning sun over Houston was sharp and unforgiving, casting long stripes of light across the courthouse steps as I made my way up. My best suit clung stiffly to my shoulders, the very one I had worn to bury my wife. Each button fastened felt like armor, a reminder that today was not just another humiliation to endure, but a battle I had to face head-on. Linda Green walked at my side, her expression calm, though her eyes betrayed a fierce focus. Ahead, I caught sight of Damien, Marla, and Ellen seated together with their attorney, their postures smug, their gazes carefully avoiding mine. The silence between us carried more weight than any words could. Inside the Harris County Courthouse, the air was cool, sterile, humming with faint echoes of other lives and other cases. When the clerk called my name, the shuffle of papers and creak of benches punctuated the gravity of the moment. I sat at my table, spine straight, palms resting steady, even as my children glanced back and forth like hunters about to enjoy their prey. Their lawyer rose first, smooth and confident, weaving words that painted me as a senile old man clinging to relevance. He spoke of supposed lapses in memory, exaggerated stumbles, and moments of forgetfulness framed as proof of incompetence. Each phrase was sharpened to cut away my dignity. Damien leaned in toward Marla, smirking, while Ellen's lips curled in a cold half-smile. The courtroom shifted uneasily, whispers flitting like gnats, the narrative of a fading patriarch spreading like smoke. When the judge turned to me, the weight of the room pressed heavy. I drew in a breath and steadied my voice, letting it ring clear without haste. I recounted exact details of the last board meeting, down to the date and the decisions made. I spoke of the mortgage I paid on Damien's first home, the loan I extended to Ellen when her business teetered on collapse. My words did not waver, each syllable slicing through the carefully woven fabric of lies. Murmurs rose in the gallery as eyes darted between me and my children, and for the first time, their confidence cracked. Linda stood, her voice cutting firm and sharp. She placed a folder of documents on the judge's bench bank records, property deeds, and account statements all in my name, all intact under my control. Then she held up an envelope, sealed, its paper yellowed by time. "This letter," she said, "was left by his late wife. It affirms his authority over his estate and his role as custodian of everything they built together." The silence that followed was different, thick, suffocating. Damien's jaw tightened, and Marla leaned toward him with panic in her whisper. Ellen's face blanched, her composure dissolving as the truth pierced through. That letter, my wife's voice echoing from beyond the grave, shattered their performance in one breath. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled, and finally spoke. "The case could not be closed today," he said. "More evidence was required, more time to review." But in that moment, the balance shifted. The courtroom no longer saw me as a failing old man, but as a father under siege, standing taller than the accusations meant to bury him. I rose slowly, my gaze fixed on the three who shared my blood. "You wanted to prove I was unfit." My words carried across the silence like iron striking stone. "You may regret opening that door." Their eyes flickered not with guilt, but with the fear of a battle they no longer controlled. And as I walked out beneath the courthouse columns, the suit on my shoulders no longer felt like armor. It felt like a declaration. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that hums before a storm. When Ellen called and said they wanted a family talk, I agreed without hesitation. There was no reason to pretend I didn't see what they were trying to do. The trap was obvious, but I had no intention of walking into it unprepared. I straightened my shoulders and walked into that dining room, as if I still owned every nail that held it together. Because I did. The table was set, the lights too bright, and the smiles too rehearsed. Damien leaned back in his chair like a man already certain of victory, while Marla folded her hands with that polite venom she'd perfected over the years. Ellen's face was harder to read, but her eyes darted toward me like I was the problem to be solved. It didn't take long for the accusations to begin. Ellen slammed her fork against her plate, saying I was dragging the family's name through the mud by letting lawyers get involved. Her voice shook not from fear, but from indignation. Damien snorted, adding that I was stubborn, irrelevant, clinging to an authority I no longer deserved. His words were sharp, designed to slice through what respect might still linger between us. The table shook as Damien's hand slammed down. Ellen raised her voice louder than I'd ever heard. For a moment, it felt less like a family dinner and more like a courtroom without rules. Their anger came in waves, each one higher than the last, until the room buzzed with hostility. I let them rage, listening with the calm of a man who had weathered storms far greater than their shouting. When I finally spoke, I didn't raise my voice. I reminded them of what it took to build all of this, the long nights, the risks I carried alone, The years when their mother's faith in me was the only thing that kept food on this table. Loyalty. I told them, not greed, is what holds a family together. My words cut the noise, but only for a heartbeat. Then they tried to shout me down again, as if the louder their voices, the truer their lies. That was when the door creaked open, and Gregory Shaw stepped in. My old friend's presence was like a thunderclap. He looked at each of them in turn before speaking. "Your mother," he said, his voice steady, "told me herself that everything here was meant to protect your father. She trusted him, not you, with her legacy." His words struck harder than anything I could have said. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Damien shifting in his chair. Damien's composure cracked, his face reddened, and in his fury he shouted, "I deserve the company after all the work I did covering debts. It should be mine." The words slipped out like poison, exposing the truth he never meant to say aloud. His confession hung in the air, undeniable and damning. Ellen's hand froze halfway to her glass. Marla's face paled. I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. "At last, your greed speaks louder than your lies." My words cut through the room, and for the first time that night, none of them had an answer. Ellen's eyes filled with tears, her face torn between defending her husband and confronting the truth that had just unraveled before her. The storm had broken, and for once, it was their walls, not mine, that showed the first cracks. The silence after his confession was louder than any shouting match. We all knew the battle had changed forever. The morning light crept in through the blinds, pale and cold. The silence in the house was heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. No one came to greet me at the table. No sounds of cheerful breakfast chatter, only the faint clinking of dishes in the kitchen, muffled whispers behind closed doors. My body still carried the exhaustion from the shouting match the night before, yet my mind was wide awake, playing back every word that had been hurled across that dining room. Stepping outside for a walk, I noticed neighbors glancing over their fences. Their eyes didn't need to say much. News travels faster than the wind in this town. I overheard fragments. "Did you hear what Damien admitted? They said it was about the company funds. Can you believe turning on their own father?" Each whispered word carried both pity and condemnation. None directed at me. For once, the whispers weren't knives cutting into my back. They were arrows pointing at the truth. By mid-morning, the tension inside boiled over. Ellen stood firm, her voice trembling but resolute. "Father has every right. He built this family's name." The younger son shot back, siding with Damien, his voice sharp and defensive. "You don't understand what it takes to run things now." He's clinging to the past. Their words clashed like steel on steel, louder and louder, until the house itself seemed to quake. I didn't join the argument, I simply watched, my chest tight. Relief came with Ellen's defense, sorrow with my son's betrayal. Then Rebecca broke. She sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking, sobs spilling out uncontrollably. "I never wanted this," she cried. "Damien promised he'd make everything easier, that we'd finally have control. But it's tearing us apart." The sound of her grief cut through the chaos sharper than any accusation. I went to her side, resting a hand on her shoulder. My own heart was torn, yet I couldn't abandon her in that moment. "Rebecca," I said softly, "mistakes can be forgiven. What matters is what you do now." Her tears soaked her hands, her head bowed, and for a moment she was my little girl again. Not the woman who had stood silently while they tried to erase me. As the day dimmed, the air grew heavy again. No one spoke. The weight of truth pressed down on each of us. I looked around that table, children staring into their plates. The house hushed like a church after a funeral. "This is only the beginning," I warned. My words carried not as a threat, but as fact. The truth doesn't stay hidden. It claws its way to the surface. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door shattered the silence. A neighbor stood there with an envelope in hand, sealed and official. "This was delivered to us by mistake," he said. The weight of it in my palm told me everything. It wasn't over. It was only the next battle. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper when I stepped inside that afternoon. The cane clicked against the marble floor with every step, echoing through the corridor like a drumbeat announcing my presence. Strangers glanced at me, some with curiosity, others with pity. I could feel the weight of their eyes, whispering about the old man who had been dragged into court by his own blood. My children sat on the far side of the hall, huddled together but fractured, their silence speaking louder than any words. Not one of them looked my way. The courtroom felt colder than the December air outside. Damien, my son-in-law, sat tall in his crisp suit, his smirk as polished as the silver cufflinks at his wrists. He didn't avoid my gaze, he welcomed it, daring me to flinch. Ellen sat beside him, her lips pursed tight, a hand nervously twisting her wedding band. My younger son tapped his foot under the table. While my eldest daughter kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the opposing lawyer rose first, his tone syrupy but sharp enough to cut. He painted me as a bitter relic of the past, a man clinging to property and power long after reason had left him. Damien leaned forward, nodding solemnly, then added fuel to the fire. He can't manage anything anymore. He declared, the businesses, the house, even the finances, he's driven everything into ruin. We've carried his burden for years. He's nothing but a shadow now, angry and confused. His words sliced through me. My hands trembled on the cane, but I forced my face to remain calm. Around me, I caught the unease of my own children, some nodding ever so slightly as if Damien's performance had seduced them. I felt the burn of humiliation, but I swallowed it down. Silence was my armor, and I knew better than to break too soon. Then Linda Green rose. She adjusted her glasses, her expression calm but steely, and carried a stack of documents to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "these claims of incompetence are not only unfounded, they are deceitful." She lifted the first deed, the embossed seal catching the light. "This is the title to the family home, signed solely by my client." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. She laid down another sheet. "Here are bank records, investment accounts, and company filings, every one of them under his control, every transaction accounted for." Finally, she produced a sealed envelope, worn with age but still intact. "And this," she said, "is a letter from his late wife, filed with the estate attorney years ago. In it, she makes clear her intent that her husband retain full authority over all family assets. Her words, not mine." The judge broke the seal, read silently, and nodded. The air shifted instantly. Gasps rose from the gallery. I saw neighbors exchange looks of shock, even sympathy. Damien's confidence cracked, his jaw tightening as he leaned toward Ellen, whispering furiously. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lift slightly from my shoulders. Vindication wasn't sweet, it was heavy, like a burden that had been waiting too long to be set down. My eldest daughter bowed her head in shame, tears brimming in her eyes. My younger son's face turned pale, the truth dawning on him like a blow to the chest. Rebecca leaned toward me, whispering so softly only I could hear, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know." The judge cleared his throat. "We will recess. The evidence presented today requires careful review. But let me be clear, the narrative of incompetence has been severely undermined." His gavel struck, and the sound reverberated like thunder in the chamber. I rose slowly, gripping the cane tighter, and glanced across the room. Damien's face was flushed with rage, his composure unraveling. As I passed him, He leaned close, his words a venomous hiss. "This isn't over, old man. You'll regret this." I didn't answer. The truth had spoken louder than I ever could. As I stepped out into the cold afternoon light, one thought echoed in my mind. Truth has a weight of its own. You can't bury it forever. The living room felt heavier than ever, though nothing in it had changed. The old clock still ticked against the wall. My wife's framed photograph still watched over the mantel, and the same rug stretched beneath our feet. Yet the silence filling the air carried more weight than furniture ever could. My children arrived in uneven steps, one after another. Their voices clipped, their eyes refusing to meet mine. They sat across from me like guests visiting a stranger, not children returning to their father's home. Small talk about the weather, about the traffic on I-45 fizzled before it even found rhythm. My chest tightened at the realization it wasn't the world outside we feared to discuss. It was what had been said in court, what had been revealed at our dinner table, and what we all knew could not be unsaid. The first crack came suddenly. My eldest daughter, Rebecca, had been trying to keep her composure. Her fingers twisted at the hem of her blouse, her jaw clenched as if fighting words back. Then her shoulders shook, and she broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, words tumbling out between gasps. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I doubted you. I let him." She pointed toward the door where her husband wasn't even present. "I let him fill my head with lies. I thought you were losing it. I thought you were the problem." The sound of her confession cracked me deeper than any insult had. It wasn't anger I felt then, but a raw sorrow. For months, she had looked at me with suspicion, treating me like a relic too fragile to carry truth. Now her words spilled like water breaking through a dam, and her grief became a mirror of my own. I rose slowly, every joint stiff, but not from age, from the burden of watching my own blood break before me. Placing a hand on her shoulder, I steadied my voice. "I accept your apology, Rebecca. But remember, this trust is like glass. Once broken, you can piece it together, but the cracks will always remain. It will take time." Her sobbing quieted into shivers, but her hand gripped mine tightly, as though afraid to let go again. The fragile moment shattered when my younger son, Damien, leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Don't fall for this performance," he snapped. "You think one tear makes everything right. He's the reason we're all like this. He's been clinging to control, refusing to let us live our lives." Rebecca turned on him, her voice sharp with fury. "You think this is about control? You let your wife manipulate all of us, and you still defend her lies." Their words collided like glass shattering on stone. They stood, pointing fingers, voices overlapping in rage. The room felt smaller, the air hotter, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I lifted my hand, not to silence them, but to cut through the noise with calm. "Enough." My voice wasn't raised, but it carried weight born of years and sacrifice. "You fight because you fear the truth. You blame me because it's easier than facing your own choices. But one day, truth will weigh heavier than pride. And when that day comes, you will understand what I endured." Damien sneered, shaking his head. "You'll die lonely, old man. That's what you deserve." His words struck like a cold knife. Yet I didn't flinch. Rebecca gasped, covering her mouth in horror, while another child whispered for him to stop. But he stormed out, the door slamming so hard the house quivered. Silence fell again, heavier than before. This time it wasn't just the air, it was the fracture, the undeniable divide cutting through my family. As night drew on, I sat alone in my chair. Staring at the photo of my late wife, I spoke softly, as though she might hear me. "Forgiveness can't be forced. Maybe time will heal. Maybe it won't. But I will not let bitterness decide who I am." The clock ticked on. My children sat scattered, some with tears, some with empty stares. None of us had the strength to speak further. Then the phone rang. Its sharp cry broke through the stillness, startling everyone. I picked it up, pressing it to my ear. Linda Green's voice was steady but urgent. "They're preparing an appeal," she said. "Your son-in-law isn't finished." I ended the call and looked around the room at my fractured family, at the faces caught between shame and defiance. A storm loomed again, not just in court, but in the fragile bonds that tied us together. That night, one truth burned clear in my chest. The next battle would test more than my rights. It would test what was left of my family's soul. The courthouse doors loomed tall, yet there was no fear in my steps that morning. The cane tapped against the polished floor as I moved forward, steady and deliberate. My suit, the same dark one I wore the day I buried my wife, felt like armor now. This was no funeral, though. This was Judgment Day. Not just for me, but for the children who had tried to erase me from the life I built. Inside. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Neighbors filled the benches, their whispers circling like restless birds. My son-in-law sat smugly with his lawyer, confident, as though the lies he'd spun would somehow outweigh the truth. My own children sat scattered, not unified, their faces etched with shame, defiance, or indifference. I lowered myself into the chair at the front. My hands rested calmly on the cane. I had no words to waste. I would let truth carry the weight today. The opposing attorney began with venom disguised as reason. He claimed I was reckless, that my decisions had nearly ruined the family's wealth. That age had clouded my mind. My son-in-law leaned forward, nodding eagerly, as though each lie heaped on me was another stone on my coffin. I sat still. I let them speak. Their desperation was loud enough to convict them without my help. When their side finally rested, Linda Green rose. Her voice was firm but steady, slicing through the fog of deceit like a blade. She laid out the property deeds, bank records, and contracts I had signed years ago, documents they thought were hidden or forgotten. Each one bore my name, my decisions, my careful foresight. Then came the final piece, the sealed letter from my late wife. Linda read it aloud, her words echoing in the chamber. My wife had written of her faith in me, her wish that what we built together remain under my guidance until the day I chose to pass it on. She had seen what I see now, that greed can destroy a family if not kept in check. Gasps filled the room, my son-in-law's face drained of color. My daughter buried her face in her hands. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and heavy. The court finds no grounds to strip Mr. Bellamy of his rights. The appeal is dismissed. The words rang like a hymn. Vindication surged through me, not with triumph, but with a quiet, steady dignity. The judge turned sternly toward my son-in-law. This court will not tolerate the exploitation of elders, nor the twisting of truth for personal gain. You should be ashamed. The cameras caught it all. In the days that followed, headlines spoke not of my supposed incompetence, but of resilience, of a father standing firm against betrayal. When I returned home that evening, exhaustion weighed on me, but so did peace. My eldest daughter sat waiting in the living room, eyes red but softer than before. She whispered an apology. Tentative, fragile, I nodded, accepting the first stitch in what might one day heal the wound. But not all bonds could be mended. My younger son stormed past without a glance, bitterness still chaining him to his pride. Some lessons come slowly, even painfully. Later, I gathered them together, the ones still willing to listen. I revealed the final truth: much of the estate was already placed in a trust. But not for them. It was for their children, my grandchildren, untouched by greed, still innocent. Their education, their future, that was where the wealth would rest. The silence that followed was thick, but it carried weight. Some of my children sat stunned. Others nodded in quiet understanding. I leaned back in my chair, eyes drawn to the photograph of my late wife. Money comes and goes, I said softly. But dignity, respect, and justice, those are the true inheritance. If you've forgotten that, then I've failed you. But I hope your children will remember. That night, I sat alone, the house quiet once more. Yet it was not loneliness, I felt it was peace. I once thought my legacy was the company I built, the wealth I earned, the house I paid for brick by brick. Now I know better. My legacy is the way I endured, the way I stood firm when betrayal tried to break me, the way I chose to leave behind not just riches, but a lesson. Because money fades, houses crumble, but the way we treat one another, the respect we give or deny that echoes long after we are gone,